And we're live. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to guys. Shout out to the guys in the chat. And welcome to my guest, Joshua City from 86Boxing. What's up, Josh?
Hey, what's going on, Random? Salute to everyone who's here in the chat. Appreciate you being here. Look forward to another discussion on the great Harry Wills.
Absolutely. So up here on the screen, we haven't really touched on it too much, but we have the great Joe Jeanette on the left there. There he is getting a rub down on before or after a fight. On the right there, that's a photo I found in the newspaper archives where I spend a lot of my time. That's actually the earliest photo I'm aware of him. That's from 1905 newspaper, and that's the clipping where they were promoting. I think it was the Boston Sunday Post or the Boston Post where they were promoting his first fight with Sam Langford, which happened in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is approximately north of Boston, like in one of the industrial towns up toward New Hampshire. So they had other fights, but I just wanted to open with that awesome picture on the right there because when I first found it and I see a baby face Jeanette that I hadn't seen before, that was a real thrill. But Josh, we were gonna just touch a little bit. There wasn't too much action between the great Joe Jeanette and Harry Wills, but they did interact, and it just right away I'll say, if I've got this right, they fought twice. They fought in mid 1913. Jeanette had 77 wins against 16 losses, and by the time they fought in October of 1919, Jeanette had was up to 120 wins, but it only picked up six more losses. He had 22 losses. Absolutely remarkable. Jeanette, McVeigh, Langford, and later Wills, these guys put on these monster streaks. But they would sometimes, when they would fight each other enough, which they did, they'd have reversals, they'd fight to draws, they'd have different round counts. But Josh, what are your thoughts on this great cardio machine, the Iron Man, Joe Jeanette, and his interactions with the great Harry Wills twice? Once when Wills was a newbie, and then once when Wills was in his full prime.
Hey, Random. Actually, I want to throw it out there that they actually fought another time in 1914, as a matter of fact. They fought to a draw in 1914. It was in the middle of 1914, June 9th, actually.
Oh, for real? Oh man, I
Yeah,
messed
yeah,
up my graphic. Sleep
down in New
deprivation.
Orleans.
I blame sleep deprivation.
Oh yeah, yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, it can be, you can have that mixture, especially considering the length of time between that last fight or between that second fight and the final, third and final. But it was actually two draws that the two of them had prior to Wills eventually getting the win in 1919 while he was in his prime, actually. But yeah, certainly when it comes to Joe Jeanette, I think his name speaks volumes. We all know that he is one of those great champions and a bit of an unsung or colored champion, of course, not world champion by standard of the actual lineal title, but you can say unsung champion in some sense. But certainly, he is one of those guys who was one of the best of the era, and I highlighted in one of the previous episodes, probably or both of the previous episodes, or all three of them actually, might have highlighted the fact that even Jack Johnson acknowledged that Joe Jeanette was his toughest challenge. And I think that he probably did so for a multitude of reasons, of course, when he fought Sam Langford. That was earlier on in Langford's career. And at the time, Langford wasn't really actually a heavyweight. I think he was probably barely in that middleweight range or somewhere around there. And so, as far as my understanding, when he fought the times that he actually fought Joe Jeanette, Jeanette, of course, is very much a full fledged heavyweight in that sense. And he provided a lot of problems for Jack Johnson because he was a very good boxer from a technical standpoint. He knew how to use the jab very well. And for Jack Johnson, especially in his rise up, he had to become more of I guess you can call it, defensive fighter. Early on, he was more on the offensive side, looking to gain those knockouts. And of course, he suffered some defeats early on in his career, even to some smaller guys, the likes of Joe Cherinsky, etc. And I think that's because as he went through that process, he began to gain more of an understanding of his capabilities, but more of the pugilism side, the defensive side of boxing, and how to essentially hit and not get hit. Now, it was not in the conventional sense with some of the movers that we're accustomed to seeing these days, but in Jack Johnson's era, in this style, it was really more of the type where he knew how to control the inside, control the clinches, to do what he could to nullify his opponent's offense. And while doing so, he knew how to slip in punches of his own to essentially gain those edges, gain that lead. Now, Joe Jeanette, he posed a problem for him because he was very much a heavyweight, as mentioned, long arms, long jab, and he had a good mix of everything from an all around standpoint. He had good power, he had good speed, and he had a high IQ. So for Jack Johnson, his journey to becoming world heavyweight champion, certainly he had to go through some of these trials and tribulations dealing with the likes of a Joe Jeanette, the likes of a Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh, etc. Other fighters, he was in there with the likes of fireman Jim Flynn, for instance. It's just a whole multitude of fighters. So Jeanette was one of those guys that was highly rated at the time, and of course we know about Joe Jeanette in his rivalry with Sam McVeigh, which was probably a more profound the more profound rivalry for Joe Jeanette. His work that he was able to do with Sam McVeigh, them having a ton of classic fights, especially the one in the year escapes me, but of course the great fight in France that went 49 rounds. I'm sure, Random, you know the exact date and everything, but this is a classic fight and one that, if you just look in the history of the sport, can stand above many, if not all, just given the brutality of said fight between Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh. And this is the type of stuff that hardens you as a fighter. And through that, and of course, his rivalries with others like Johnson and Langford, and ultimately some of the other great heavyweights of the time, including Harry Wills, this helped to add to what would become that prime, sort of generally considered best heavyweight in the world at the time, Harry Wills. And I don't think it would have been quite the same had not he had to go through some of these early trials and virtues with the likes of Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, two men you see there on the screen, who are some of the best to ever lace them up beyond just simply the heavyweight division.
Yeah, all good points. This was an incredible era, and like Wills came in and he got to fight among a lot of other people. He was fighting these guys. These guys are terrifying. All of these guys are great fighters. They would have dominated weaker eras, but they came in and they had along with the great Jack Johnson, like these four guys. This was serious to the point where in the newspapers, certain writers, especially when Langford was in England, after it was one of his, it was either when he destroyed Iron Haig or when he destroyed Bill Lang, one of the London fights, and the writer was actually advising. They're basically saying freeze these great black fighters out, and then get some white boys in there and get them tons of experience and basically mimic what these guys did and just draw the line tight because no one can beat these guys. So it was a very interesting time, even though Johnson wasn't. Once he relinquished the colored world title, to just defend what had been the white title, what would again become the white title until Joe Louis, the great Joe Louis. But Johnson, he didn't fight Wills. There was a window there where it could have happened, but Johnson was doing his other thing and also facing some persecution back at home, so he was on the road. It was a very complicated time. These other three guys, they were there for Wills. And even though he didn't have as many fights with each of them as with Langford, I mean, who fights a guy between 18 and 22 times? I mean, Sam Langford would be one of them. And I just want to recommend this excellent book on Langford because it does get into the whole rivalry between Langford and his great contemporaries by Clay Moyle. This book is worth every penny. That's a picture of my copy from before it started to completely disintegrate. But anyway, so Will's becoming Langford's better, just being able to do it. Like there was a how to put this. So there's like in the way people discuss the world championship today, they just talk about like the undisputed champ, and then the colored belts were like set aside as less than. I mean, I was a little confused why it's like that. I guess people are uncomfortable just pointing out how it used to be, but there was a lineage. There was a point at which Denver Ed Martin outclassed Bob Armstrong, and he was supposed to be matched with the winner of Fitzsimmons and Jeffries. I saw this in the paper, and I think it was Jeffries won and then drew the line. So like part of the reason the Jack Johnson fight was so huge is there was a tension between these great fighters, but there's a rich lineage of the colored title that's easily as rich as what was essentially the white title Johnson accepted. It's like here are the guys in the bottom left there. That's Sam Langford with his training crew. Left to right's Langford, Bob Armstrong, king of the battle royale, then Liver Davis, and then Georgie Byers on the right there. And Georgie Byers was a fellow Canadian who held it. So like the colored titles weren't like a national thing. It was a world title. The newspapers listed when they listed the champs in each division, they had two listings for heavyweight because there were two champions. So part of the enormity of the Johnson Jeffries fight was that even though Johnson had stopped defending the color title, like they just accepted that he had that lineage, and so it was sort of unifying. It was for all the marbles, even though Jeffries was older. But there were a lot of respectable champions, and like so Langford as an opponent, he was trained by two former colored heavyweight champions, George Byers and Bob Armstrong, in the top right there. So he came from, he was brought up from class. He wasn't just a brawler. He had supreme technique. Langford had one of the most vicious left hooks of all time. There he is giving Bill Lang a cuff upside the head. But Langford apparently he was like so he could jab high and low and feint and things like that. He had a very educated lead hand from very early in his career, I see in the reports. But he would feint low and then come upstairs with a thing for MMA fans. Fedor used to do that. He'd feint the right hand and use that to chamber the left hook, almost like a gazelle punch, like where you hit them with your whole body. Rocky would do stuff like that with his little arm, I say little arms with his short cannons. But Langford, was like a formidable opponent and had been trained by champions. And so Will's coming in and eventually taking over from him was something extra special because of Langford's unique schedule. He was fighting. He Langford was he was proving himself among the best all the time. You know what I mean? Like he was clocking guys left and right, and then he would fight some of his great contemporaries with mixed results. But Will's being able to take over there was extra special. Johnson, it's a shame we didn't get a Johnson Wills, but of course Johnson was on a different thing. But Jeanette fought a who's who, Langford fought a who's who, McVeigh fought a who's who, Wills fought a who's who. So many great matchups. And now later in his career, Josh, when he was in his 30s, when he was getting into his mid 30s, that was when sort of the second round of talks about a possible Dempsey fight came around, and it was like you mentioned last time they were both older, and it wouldn't have been necessarily the same fight. When would you say we could call Harry Will's absolute peak? His prime would have been a number of years, and he went on trying to remember his longest streak. I think it was like 30 something fights, 36 fights, unbeaten. But when would you think his absolute peak was?
Yeah, and in the midst of that unbeaten streak, you can also factor in he actually had a DQ loss to, I believe it was battling Jim Johnson or something of that nature. Or as a matter of fact, not a DQ loss, but he got injured actually, uh, and he broke his wrist in one of those fights with, I believe it was battling Jim Johnson. So by nature of that, of course, he ended up not being able to continue. But outside of that, he had a streak there of several years where He was just an unbeatable force in the heavyweight division. And I would say, just based on looking at his career from when he started there early on in 1911, him turning pro, and those early fights to the point where you could start to see the turn, the change, I would really say probably between 1918 and 1922, Harry Wills was in his absolute prime, and at that particular time, you'd be hard pressed to find any heavyweight in the world that could defeat him. And he was going up against Sam Langford at that particular time. And of course, Langford, he was on the tail end of his career at this point. But early on, when the two started their rivalry, it was pretty much a lesson of learning for Harry Wills, I would say, as Langford and he would draw a few times. Then there were points where Langford would beat him. Langford was able to knock him out, of course. But as Harry entered his prime, it got to the point where even the great Sam Langford, uh, or formidable but aging Sam Langford, uh, could no longer defeat him, and he was still very much a threat in the division just across the board. So during that period, you would see really the best of Harry Wills around 1918, and that's also when you started to see more of the calls and clamoring for a potential Harry Wills versus Jack Dempsey fight, because Dempsey, of course, he was in line in essentially that one chosen to take on Jess Willard, who after beating Jack Johnson, he only fought once against Frank Moran, and that was a draw. And it would be Dempsey thereafter. So Dempsey was the person chosen to take him on. And we know the thrill of what happened in that particular fight, and being able to see Dempsey and have that captured on film, which even adds more to the mystique, more to the aura, more to just the mega star that is Jack Dempsey. Certainly having that video, but we were able to see that, and of course the public at the time, they got behind Dempsey. This was just ushering in that offensive side of the heavyweight division, having gone through the likes of Johnson and Willard, and even just a little just beyond those two, even the style that Dempsey brought was something new, and it was cinematic in a sense because it just so happens to coincide with the time that video and replay of these fights became a bit more widely available. And Dempsey was sort of the perfect person to take on that mantle at that particular time in 1919. So this also happened to coincide with Harry Wills, and naturally, of course, that would be the calling for the two of them to face each other because they were pretty much universally considered to be the two best heavyweights at the time, and in some held Harry Wills in higher regards as far as they believed that he was, in all likelihood, the best heavyweight at that particular time, despite Dempsey. And there were several strides made to actually get this fight in place and to actually make this fight happen, while essentially the two of them were in their prime. And we kind of touched on this in the last video. It's not that Harry Wills was only in his prime. It just so happened that Dempsey was in his prime as well. I mean, the most opportune time for the both of them, while they were both still hungry and thriving and at their best, would have been pretty much in that neighborhood of around the end of 1919, maybe through 1920, 21. And I mean, all things considered, there seemingly was nothing truly preventing it outside of the political side of boxing, behind the scenes in a sense, and we know how that can be. But certainly, if we think about Harry Wills and sort of the legend of the man, the way that be he was able to thrive from the inside on fighters, slicing them with uppercuts, and using that as a truly a weapon of his. Him using his long arms, reach and jab, and just being able to work his craft from the outside with straight punches as well, and just being that total and all around package. That was most certainly through those years of 1918 through 1922. That's what I that's what I seem to be able to gather in just looking at his history.
I see. Yeah, good point. Yeah, the the run he went on, especially like 18, 19, 20, and 21, he was absolutely, as the boxing librarian would say, imperious. Like this guy was devastating. And, against fighters below the level of like a Langford. I mean, look at this year in 1918. This he beats McVeigh, beats Langford, McVeigh, the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark, couple fights against the Jack Thompson fella, John Lester Johnson, guys with mostly even records. Then he beats Langford, Clark, Langford, Joe Jeanette, Sam Langford, and then a couple other guys who are not on their level. Like it's incredible what he's doing year to year. And those wins, he's beating all these different stylists. So Langford would like to walk people down, but he could lead, but he could also counter off the counter. He had a nearly invincible chin, and just the most tremendous punching power possible. But then he also, we'd like Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, jabber mover, an extremely mobile gentleman. Here he is here, and was able to consistently, better his results. And just, but the last, I think it was 6 fights, right? He just battered him. But I think, there were fights that Wills couldn't get. He was doing his best. He was definitely he wanted that work and he wanted that title shot. And like you said, when Dempsey won the championship, Wills was in his prime. Like they was prime versus prime, and they kind of waited him out. And by the time they were really even thinking about it seriously, he was older. He wasn't what he had once been. Like guys can still be world class. We mentioned this in the last episode. Guys can still be world class past their prime. Langford was a great example of that. He still beat some great fighters when he was clearly not what he once was. Johnson was still arguably the best in the world when he was in his 30s, which at this time was considered old. But Wills fought, he fought late in his, into age. I think he was 43 when he finally retired. But, Johnson fought past his physical prime. A lot of these guys, especially once it's time to make the money. So Dempsey himself, would you say, Josh, from what you know, by the time Dempsey lost to Gene Tunney, he wasn't what he'd been when he was coming up and destroying everyone, hungry and whatnot?
Yeah, I would certainly say that was the case. Yeah, it was sort of twofold with Dempsey as it relates to just him and his career, and then the whole Harry Wills piece of it. So when we think about Harry Wills and him being in his prime, and that kind of coinciding with Dempsey at that point in which they could actually go against each other and they would legitimately have been considered the two best heavyweights in the world. But even as we extended beyond that, when the chatter had picked back up of those two fighting again and them actually signing in 1925 to actually face each other, uh, at that point, Harry Wills during this time, he continued to fight each year. And sprinkled in there, Dempsey had 2 years where he didn't fight at all. Now, of course, we relay that to the fact of that with the heavyweight division, especially at that time. And generally, I guess it can be considered sort of the same today. Just comes a different level of fame and opportunity. And Dempsey, he really started to get more into those opportunities that were there outside of the sport of boxing. A lot of money involved, a lot of a lot of people calling him from varying walks of life, different angles and different things that, of course, he could provide a boost to, at least from their particular trade. And of course, he could generate funding himself in doing so. So you would see more headlines with Dempsey. You would see Dempsey, as I mentioned in one of the previous ones. You would see him in videos with Charlie Chaplin. You know, we saw a comedic side of Dempsey, just a mix of all of that. And of course, boxing was still there, and that's how he got to that point. But it was not necessarily the focus, and I think that kind of played into why he had a couple of years there prior to him actually taking on Tunney, where he didn't even fight. And additionally, the money got even greater for him. I think one of the things was, of course, that fight over Willard in that win, and then just the thought and destruction tied to it that helped to elevate and boost him. Then he gets into another exciting fight with Luis Angel Firpo. This adds a boost to him because this is just something amazing seeing it on film, of course. And then, of course, that continues to add to the aura. He's on top of all the headlines at that particular time, and he's being compared to the likes of Babe Ruth, who was considered to be the probably one between Dempsey, Babe Ruth, and my understanding Red Grange, who was I guess more on the football side. These were probably the three most popular athletes from in and around that time. And of course, you have a boxer there, the world heavyweight champion, and that essentially sat above the majority, if not all, in sports at that particular time because of the history of boxing, the popularity and peak of boxing at that time. So you had that for Dempsey. So I think it was just a matter of the fame, the money, and of course that affects how you go about training and then your desire to be in the ring. He I think got married at that particular time or somewhere in the mix of there, so somewhere right there at his height, of course. uh, he got in a relationship and started to get more serious. He got married, of course. That changes the dynamic. So by the time that he fought Gene Tunney, uh, in I would say that at that particular time, yeah, he was probably not, yeah, not focused on boxing to that degree. Tunney became an opponent and an opportunity that was out there, and of course, it turned out to be a lucrative thing for Jack Dempsey, much like the lucrative fight he had with George Carpentier some years prior. I guess it would have been around 5 years prior to that first Tunney fight. So of course that was an opportunity he couldn't resist after having been out of the ring. He ended up getting the first $1 million gate in boxing, 1.7 million with George Carpentier, and that was surpassed by his contest with Gene Tunney, where he was able to help usher in the first $2 million gate at that particular time. Uh, the number escapes me, but I think it was around 2.1 million uh, as far as the gate in. I want to say it was the second fight. I believe it was the second fight that was in Soldier Field in 27. I could be wrong. Definitely check that out. But yeah, so you're talking about a guy who ushered in those uh, huge paydays. I don't recall what the payday it was on his fight with Gene Tunney, but I know in his fight with George Carpentier, he made over 300,000 equivalent equivalent today. That's multiple millions, of course, but he made over 300,000 at that time in just what he was getting as sort of his base salary or guaranteed, I guess you can say. Then that did not include his radio rights that came along with it. So that Carpentier fight made him a very, very rich man as it related to sports and the amount of money you can generate in sports. And you have to think about like for baseball or some of the other sports, they weren't making the type of money that some of these boxers, especially the heavyweight champion of the world, was getting as far as NFL football or whatever iteration it was there. They were in their infancy to a certain degree, so they definitely were not making much money at all. And you just got to think about what that does for a man. So that also sprinkled into why he had some years there where he didn't compete. I mean, from a financial standpoint, he didn't need to. Of course, the it was the fight was probably more needed for Wills in terms of being able to solidify himself as the best out there as opposed to Dempsey because with the amount of money and the amount of press he was generating, you were going to have a large segment of the population that was going to view him as the best heavyweight in the world, regardless of whether he faced Wills, and for some of them, Wills may not have been on the radar from a mainstream perspective, but this would have been a big fight, and I think it would have been a lucrative fight had the two been able to match up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and like we'd mentioned in the last episode, they pulled 500 newspapers, and Dempsey Wills was the. I'm not sure what year they did that, but Dempsey Wills came in first, and then Dempsey Tommy Gibbons was behind in some votes, but was the next most popular, which was a fight that did happen and bankrupted the town. Dempsey got his,
Yeah.
and then Tommy Gibbons got nothing, and the town went bankrupt. So
Yep, and so that kind of pushes the notion or excuse that there was no interest in the Wills fight. I think, and this is something that, of course, Doc Kearns, who was Dempsey's manager at the time, he was throwing out there that the public wouldn't back it or whatever. They didn't back Dempsey versus Gibbons, given what transpired in terms of it being hosted. It wasn't a sold out affair, accordingly.
yeah, they took a bath on that one. A shout out to the chat. Let me just shout everyone in the chat. Thanks for coming, guys. Let me go up to the top here. Martin, thanks for being here. You came here early bird. Uh, big up Nick. There you are in the chat, Josh. Big up you. You know, Martin, Nick, Con Shonry. What's happening, brother? Yeah. So anyway, we with Wills, it's like, you know, I guess with these great fighters of the past, you know, it depends on what people are looking for. Because if you're talking about a superstar success story, Jack Dempsey was the key figure of that time, even out overshadowing Harry Grebb's 45-0. If you count newspaper decisions, 45-0, 1919, which is remarkable, might be the greatest year anyone ever had. To cross three weights, Hall of Famers at middle and light heavy, and then even some heavyweight guys, incredible. But Dempsey was the hot stuff as far as his fame and his earning power, and him and his promoter definitely capitalized on that. And they knew that, you know, just like coming up, Dempsey didn't want to fight Langford or some of the other guys. You know, he was smashing people, and I think you can say fairly that Dempsey earned his shot, but then he should have been given the guys who'd earned a shot. You know, just like Jack Johnson. By the time Jack Johnson, who had been stiffed, he'd been the colored, you know, world champ since 1903. When he finally got his shot in 1908, I think he was about 30. You know, he'd already done so much by the time he had that claim to have captured what had been the white title. You know, Dempsey had already done an awful lot on his way up. He cracked a lot of chins. So I don't think anyone could resent him getting a shot, but other guys had been stiffed out of a shot, and then he sort of followed that pattern, just like Johnson had. So it's unfortunate, but looking back, you know, if you're looking for sporting competition, the color titles were as hotly contested as the world title. They were just as international. I think it was 5 of the 18 men who held the colored, you know, heavyweight world championship were foreign born. They weren't Americans. And I think it's 4 of 14 for the other belt were non-Americans. So it's not really, you know, 5/18ths, 4/14ths. It's not really that far apart as far as which belt was more international. But so for me, looking back, just trying to figure out the sport, you know, and I'm seeing in the newspapers these are separate titles. I just look at the great battles, and Wills, I think we can say, had a remarkably tough career and did extremely well with it. You know, he almost got the Dempsey fight. He got 50 grand apparently, but then something about Jack's guarantee won it. But then Wills was allowed to keep the money. Maybe that's what he invested in real estate because not everyone was. Although when he switched managers, Josh, do you know offhand when he got the other manager who sort of like got him better billing as far as like the pay and everything? Do you remember when that happened?
Now you're referencing Harry Wills.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly when he switched managers, but I do know the point in which that Dempsey fight became sort of agreed upon. He had a deal with Tex Rickard, who had been reluctant at the time or in the early days of this fight even being mentioned to do the fight because of the fact that he felt that it was going to be something similar to Jeffries Johnson in terms of riots, etc., the potential for such. But eventually, I think that Colin was there so much that even Tex was on board, and there was a situation in which Wills had to fight a set of contenders that uh, I guess essentially had been agreed upon through Tex Rickard in order to get that Dempsey fight as sort of that grand prize. And I believe this would have happened around towards the end of 1924. And so that ended up being why he was in with the likes of Fairpo. And I think Jack Sharkey actually was one of those individuals, and then all of that was going to lead to an eventual matchup with Dempsey. So this would have been sort of late in the 1924 time frame, then heading into 1925. But I don't remember exactly when he switched managers.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess between the money he made when he was getting the more prominent pay and then that 50 grand, so he Wills was able to go out with money. He didn't die broke. You know, he was smart with his money. Langford, I saw a thing. He estimated he'd gone through $500,000 in his career. He broke it down though. He was talking about the training camp and that when you know when you're the show, when people rolling with you, that's on you. So, but I have to find that article and do a thing on it. But yeah, Langford was breaking down how you can go through 500,000 and it not seem like that much after you think of all your expenses and training camps and all this travel. But Will's, you know, we can say Will's earned that mess. He earned every penny he got, even if a large chunk of it was from a fight that didn't happen. If you look, he starts off in 11, 12, 13, got the loss to George Kid Cotton. Other than that, he's doing good. Here comes through this incredible 1914. This is when Jack Johnson's still the champ. So he does lose to Langford and McVeigh at the end of the year, but he also, you know, beats Willie Meehan and, you know, a couple other fellas. But that year after, then in 15, okay, now it's getting critical because he beats, lose to McVeigh, but then he beats Battling Jim, McVeigh, and Langford on the trot. And now it's just getting silly, you know, like he does get the in a thrilling fight, he gets the put out in the 19th round by Langford, which sort of like impacted his contendership at the time. But he certainly, you know, his next fight that was in February and March, he got that one back at least in a newspaper decision. A couple newspaper decisions that year over Langford, and they just, you know, then the draw with Langford in 1917 is the last half decent result Langford would get against Wills. And then after that, so like we were talking about earlier, I would say in 1918 he does draw over 8 rounds, at least according to the newspaper writers, with Jack Thompson at the end of the year. But 1918, he's getting the best of McVeigh, Langford twice, then McVeigh, and then Jeff Clark. I mean, that's serious stuff. So even if you move out, like say the Jack Thompson, more of an even record, that's a serious body of work in a year. He is the man. He's taken over for the four aces because this was after Johnson had lost and Willard was inactive. And so who's beating the guys who were shut out? Well, it was Harry Wills. And so by the time Dempsey wins the title and Greb has that fantastic year and Wills has a fantastic year himself. Look at that at the bottom. That's really intense. And like you mentioned, other than yeah, and he's just destroying, he's just eating souls. He should get the fight. He takes out Fulton, stops Fulton in 3, so that, you know, he's like Langford did with Jack Johnson. He's trying to beat the guys they beat. like Greb did himself, like trying to get that shot, that shot at the prize. Beat Gumboat in 21. Beat Stop Bill Tate and some other wins. It's incredible how much he did. So whatever money he got out with money and lived a comfortable life. Good for him. But I still think also it's underrated his level of competition. See, even then in 22, he gets a reversal against Tate, the DQ, comes back for the draw, but then he beats Langford, beats Kid Norfolk. We haven't mentioned Kid Norfolk, but he fought a tough schedule. That was a serious dude too. Jeff Clark twice, beats Tut Jackson. And then he's done. Then he's in his 30s now, so like he does slow down. He still beats Furpo, beats China Weinhardt in 25, and then after I think it was it a month after Dempsey lost, then he lost to Sharkey. Is that how it was timed? Yeah, I'm
Sorry,
not
I
sure.
was on mute. Sorry, I was on mute. But yeah, I believe it happened just after that, if I'm not mistaken, because yeah, this would have been prior to prior to I believe the first fight with Tunney. I need to look it up just to double check though.
It's also worth mentioning the first year of Dempsey's reign, or like the first full year of his reign. That was Harry Greb's season. Look at that season. His only loss to Tommy Gibbons uh, in May, he avenged in July. Pretty incredible. So like there were people coming for Dempsey. Greb was coming off a 45-0 year. He goes and has this incredible year, and then Wills is destroying souls. That was Langford's comeback year. So Langford, even other than Wills, and I think maybe one other cat, I think Lee Anderson, but Langford had a crazy 1920. So like Dempsey was like in the money. He's finally able to earn. He's doing the tour of money, like like all the different ways, the opportunities for the holder of that title to earn. The others had done, like you mentioned, Willard. I mean, fought Frank Moran, and then he just was off doing other stuff for several years, 3 years. The lineage, like so. Would you back me up on this? I would suggest that other than Jack Johnson briefly at the end of 1908 and the first part of 1909, there wasn't a truly undisputed champion in the gloved era until Joe Louis, because
Yeah,
there was that separation.
yeah, that is definitely something I've thought about as well. I think that there is validity to that. Even with, of course, Johnson, of course, beating Jeffries, that kind of was symbolic with such. But that being said, as far as some of the other heavyweights that was out there at the time that he didn't fight while he was a champion, that could make the claim that it wasn't such. Of course, he didn't take on Langford McVeigh or Jeanette during that period. So certainly, I think Joe Louis was essentially the turn from when it essentially became more of a prominent thing. And I would say it would have started probably there in the 30s, because of course Snelling had his run. Then of course we had Primo, and Sharkey had his opportunity, and then Max Bear, of course Braddock. So once Joe Louis got it, I think that's when we officially got into that span, as you mentioned, that okay, yeah, there's really no dispute. It isn't that we think that Joe Louis hasn't fought someone who would be considered to be one of, if not the best in the world, opposite of him. I think that kind of helped to usher it in, and then from there, for the most part, at least prior to the as we got more and more into the multi-belt era that we're in today, you got to see more of those matchups where you were getting the two best, or at least those that were considered the best at that particular time. So yeah, certainly Lewis was influential in kind of helped him push that with him having his reign for as long as he did.
Yeah, good points. Yeah, and Lewis, like Lewis was absolutely the man, but also across the whole sport. Like they were just like, this is the ultimate fighting machine.
Yes.
And Lewis, like we mentioned before, Lewis was sculpted into this in great part due to the efforts of Jack Blackburn, Chappie, who was a very brilliant defensive fighter, but it also fought a who's who. He had, multiple fights against Sam Langford. He'd fought in the up through the weights. I mean, Blackburn was, even when he was long past his best, Harry Greb, for all his offensive genius, like could only land 1 in 10. That's what it said in the report I saw. Like Blackburn was brilliant, but yeah, Joe Louis came in and he was absolutely the man. But there were a lot of champions who didn't get there. Like they fought for that other title, but they didn't get their shot. Shout out to Rocky Marciano, who didn't draw any kind of lines. Rocky didn't fight for that many years, but he, fought the great Archie Moore and the great Jersey Joe Walcott. So got to give a lot of credit to Rocky. But there were fighters, great champions of the past, like in the color title. Like I was saying, it was kind of international. You have the original Peter Jackson, the great Peter Jackson, Australian. So is that much different than, the world title where you've got Fitz, born in Cornwall, England, but the international fighters are fighting for both titles. And so yeah, Lewis was really like, he became absolutely the man. But like so like part of the, again, going back to the Johnson fight with Jeffries, part of the reason it was so big, so Jeffries retired unbeaten and he had drawn the line, so he wasn't fighting any of those champs. So Johnson had been the color champ since 03. Jeffries stepped away. I think it was in 05, wasn't it, that Root and Marvin Hart fought for the vacant title, and then Hart lost to Tommy Burns. Tommy Burns fought a furious schedule, and then in 1908 took 30 grand to from Hugh McIntosh to fight Johnson in Australia. McIntosh apparently reffed that fight too. He was like, "Here goes your money, Mac." But credit to Burns, for giving the shot. So when Johnson did that, he was the colored world heavyweight champion. He had just beaten the white champion, so he was actually the champion. This was in 1908, late 1908. In May, he was supposed to fight Sam Langford in May in London. He had borrowed money to chase Burns to Australia from the athletic club, the sporting club, and he broke contract. And they ended up printing the text of it in the papers and stuff like that. It became a whole thing. So once Johnson, the Langford fight was supposed to happen right then. So when Johnson finally got his opportunity, been a champion since 03, he finally got to fight a white champion in, while they were champ in 08, but then in 09 in May, he basically defaulted on the booking for London against Langford. So at that point, other guys started fighting for that claim. It all got sorted out. Jeanette, McVeigh, Langford, they sorted it all out in these great battles they had. But they reestablished the lineage because they were the other best guys. You had the 4 aces. Well, one of the aces was off fighting tough people, but he wasn't fighting those all-time greats. Although Johnson, I guess the fight with battling Jim in Paris was for the title. So after Johnson, battling Jim was the next colored fighter to get a title shot, and then Joe Louis. That is a long time. That is a long time with those lineages largely separated. So that's why I count both titles equally, because there were times when the champions of the white title were taking soft touches and the color belts were being fought between all-time greats. Biggest battles between Langford, Jeanette, McVeigh, Wills, and some others. And, shout out to, firstly, the Boxing Librarian, boxinglibrarian.com. Go visit Hardline Boxing Talk channel. He's got lots of stats on these fighters. Just search for the fighter's name and career on YouTube, and his will be one of the, you'll see the slides that he makes. They'll come up. And go in deeper on some of these fighters who fought crazy careers. Jeff Clark right here. He's among the top probably half dozen listings for most rounds spent in the ring with Hall of Famers. Talk about a tough career. And so like, and Langford is absolutely silly. His career is just ridiculous. So Will's taking over for Langford was monumental. if he had fought Johnson a bunch of times and beaten him, that might, obviously he was holding the prize title, but it was really actually Langford fought the tougher schedule than Johnson, who had done a lot by the time 1908 came around. But then he's fighting like, Jack O'Brien types, who was like a past prime light heavyweight, great stylist, but he was older. He wasn't gonna stop Johnson or do anything. He fought some other guys, but and shout out to George Byers on the left there and Bob Armstrong on the right there. Colored heavyweight champions, and trained Langford and got Langford up to help give him. George Byers apparently helped Langford with his left hook. That's what Langford said. And I think if there's something to take away from these discussions we're having, is like what we're trying to do is peel back the veil of history and actually find out what was happening at the time, not the myths and the things that Bert Sugar said in the documentary and stuff like that. Like, just actually go and look at what was happening at the time. I found some things in my research that contradict the way things are described in very good documentaries that I've seen. And sometimes with these titles, oftentimes with these titles, they're not talked about, but I would say a title that's been contested between, is Johnson Burns as competitive a fight as McVeigh, Jeanette, Langford, and Wills fighting each other? No, Tommy Burns is a good fighter, but he was small, and stylistically he wasn't going to get Johnson. Johnson was too clever. And I think it's important also to keep in mind, like, we're not necessarily, like, say, like with me, like, Langford deserved his title shot, but would he have beaten Johnson? Well, Johnson was 30 when he won the title. Langford was younger than him, so maybe he would, but it's not a given. So talking about the injustice doesn't necessarily mean predicting the fight, because Johnson was brilliant. He was a genius, especially at shutting people down later in his career. So Langford had uniquely potent offense and in his prime, maneuverability and all these assets, but it's not a given. And so, but celebrating fighters like Tommy Burns and like Joe Louis, who were, fighting, trying to fight a who's who while they were there, while they had it. Busy champs, busy champs are great. And also, shout out Josh. I know you're always down for this. Just again, shout out to the great Muhammad Ali, because he wanted all the smoke. When he was sitting around, it was because he was being persecuted for not wanting to go to war or not wanting to become a PR tool. So, and Muhammad Ali's schedule is absolutely ridiculous, especially as a percentage of his total fights. He didn't have a Langford 300 fight career. He had maybe a quarter of that, or less than a quarter. But he fought like most of the best heavyweights across 2 decades. You can't really find that in anyone else. I mean, even like great stylists and great champions like Dempsey and Johnson, these guys, Ali is celebrated because he went in there and tried to fight everybody. And even though he had some reversals, that didn't matter. He was out there to get it. He wanted those fights. So you got to love that. Now, the guys who were being shut out, especially Langford, he was fighting a crazy who's who schedule himself. But it was for the colored title and other fighters, the white fighters that he could get in the ring with him. But it was tough. Even when Langford was old, they didn't want it. And Wills just kept fighting him. But of course, it's the Livegate era, so club in this city is going to pay you to fight here, and then go fight over here, and then go say to Panama, and then you go, you're like, it's a live crowd. So there was a market for these fights. But sometimes even the same thing, like the same location, like McVeigh and Langford. How many fights did they have in Australia? Let me think. They had the fight December that McVeigh won. Then they had 4 fights in 1912 that Langford won. Then they fought in 1913. That's a lot of fights. That's 6 fights while they were in the one thing. Now, by the last card that fought to a draw, the interest had waned a little bit, but but the first fight I think that they had there were like 17,000 people live. That's pretty good. That's not a small fight. Hugh McIntosh was a boss. He was a good promoter. He's the reason we have some of that film. So like the Langford fights, the Bill Lang fight, McIntosh promoted that in London. Had a military band for the walkouts. Imagine that. And that was filmed. So we have part of the footage of that. And then I've seen in Australian papers advertisements for Langford doing talks over I assume a highlight of his fight with Sam McVeigh in that April 1911. So by the end of the year, so McIntosh filmed that as well, and they were using it to promote the fight series in I think it was Brisbane, the first fight in December. I think it was December 1911. They fought to a draw over 20 rounds, and McVeigh gets the best of him. And Langford was like, that was like an epic fight because McVeigh and Langford have both been beating a whole bunch of other guys. Langford went undefeated other than McVeigh that year, so he kind of snapped the momentum. And rematches delivered, but I think, you know, those fights, if I could pick any fight series, those fights that they had, those 6 fights they had in Australia, I think I would want to see that. That must have been quite a collision. That's like 2 of the greatest ever, just going at it, long fights. But there's a lot of good matchups, and Will's had his fair share. So regardless of how big the crowd was or anything like that, but he was getting in there with some dangerous fighters in and amongst some of the easier matchups that he had. Some of these guys were pretty scary dudes. They're like battling Jim over there, not the best technique, but brawler style, but like a fearsome guy, huge, bigger than Will's, 20 or 25 pounds heavier than Will's, maybe more if they fought earlier fight. You know, he's going through some people, and he's sometimes beating guys that the champion beat. Sam Langford did that. He beat like fireman Jim Flynn. They fought in 1908, and Langford, that was one of the guys Johnson had beaten. Langford, you know, stopped Flynn and won, absolutely leveled him. They fought again in early 1910. Flynn got slightly the best of her. I think it was a newspaper decision. And then they fought, I think it was scheduled maybe for 25, but then Langford stopped him in 7 or 8 viciously. But that was someone, so like guys try to beat the guys who the other guy beat. So that was like Wills was putting it on. Fulton stopped him in 3. I think Dempsey stopped him in 1, right? Have I got that correct, Josh?
Yeah, it was first round knockout. Almost 2 years to the day of the Wills versus Fulton fight. Actually, I think Dempsey beat him in, I want to say, on July 26th. What year was this? 19. Is this 18? But I know it was like 2 years to the day that Dempsey had defeated Fulton. That's when Wills had fought him, broke a rib or 2 in the process, maybe more than that. But I know he ended up breaking some ribs and stopping him.
Oh, yeah. So, hey, quick shout out to the boxing librarian again, Hardline Boxing Talk. This is from the end of his video on Wills. This is with his permission. So when the ratings kicked in, you know, Wills was rated, but that was at the end of his career. He largely had a pre-ratings era career. But I just wanted to throw up a couple stats from one of BL's videos. This is a great resource for boxing fans, historical buffs on YouTube. Just search for like you type in Harry Wills' career, his video comes up. You can enjoy that. So this is just at the end. He gives a summation of the things. So look at his title fight record. This is for the colored heavyweight world title. 33-3 with 15 stoppages, 25 defenses. That is remarkable. So like to me, thinking about who you had to fight for that compared to the other champions who were fighting for what was essentially the white title, barring Johnson, until Joe Louis, like, yeah, man, this is one of the great title fight records. And he wasn't fighting pushovers to get that. A lot of those fights were really hard fights. You know, so he definitely earned a shot. And some other guys who maybe weren't as busy, but it's important to remember they did earn a shot, like with Rocky Marciano, fantastic fighter. He did have to beat some people to get a shot, especially compared to today. He had to do a lot to get his title shot. When he got the eliminator against Kid Matthews, who I think was a light heavy primarily, moving up. Guy was on almost a half century of unbeaten. You know, the guy, you know, these was winners. Rocky was unbeaten. The other guy hadn't lost in roughly 50 fights, 49 fights, something like that. So even though Rocky didn't have a huge number of title fights, he did an awful lot to get there. And not every champ, behaves the same. Like Fitzsimmons, when he was the champ, he would hold out for money. Like Athletic Club would offer this from Chicago, and he would say, "Well, I want this." You match that. You're well aware, Josh, of all the different games, and sometimes people price themselves out. I think that's what seems to have happened with Dempsey in the Wills fight. When they finally were talking, he kind of priced himself out. But there's always money denying people the opportunity to see certain fights. But there's lots of great matchups that happened. Wills was involved in some terrific battles, and he didn't get his opportunity to be like a Muhammad Ali style champion to go try and fight everybody because he was getting frozen out. But yeah, Josh, when are we going to do our Muhammad Ali episode?
That would be a mega episode in itself, right there for sure. Yeah, we'll have to definitely discuss that at some point. But one thing I want to point out that makes boxing so intriguing, and you recalling some of those other fighters, those other champions like Fitzsimmons, Jeffrey, etc., etc. But generally, when we think about this undisputed piece of it, and kind of seeing the two best face off, uh, and of course, we say that Joe Louis, of course, he had such a long reign and pretty much took the best. It kind of continued on from there. But certainly, even since the very first days of the World Heavyweight Championship being conceived, starting with John L. Sullivan, we look back on those eras and there's always those what ifs, and we do a lot of fantasy matches, of course, but there's always those what ifs, like what if John L. Sullivan had fought the Black Prince Peter Jackson, and just the thought of that actually happening, or what if John L. Sullivan had fought the Irish giant Peter Marr, who was another prominent heavyweight at the time. There's just a ton of what ifs in that regard. And then, of course, it goes to Corbett. And Corbett, he actually fought the Black Prince. They fought to 61 rounds, and it ended up being considered a draw. But what if Corbett, once he actually defeated John L. Sullivan, had given Peter Jackson a shot at the title, and the potential of what could have happened then or there? Or, and then we can just continue on. So Fitzsimmons beat him, and of course Fitzsimmons also was one of those guys. He would fight anyone, and I hold Fitzsimmons in very high regard. But of course, once he won the title, he didn't fight as often, like what you're saying, like you mentioned. Of course, there's a lot of money involved and other things, distractions outside of it. So he didn't fight as often. But there were potential for some matchups even with him and then Jeffries and so forth. And Jeffries was one who uh, didn't have a huge career just in general in terms of fight totals, especially considering the time frame in which he fought. But we have a lot of just what ifs in general as far as just those potential matchups that we could have seen during those times. And I know like Nick Hammer, Martin, they may have mentioned there in the chat some of the other guys who were in or around there, like Frank Childs when he was the fellow champion. What about him taking on one of the heavyweights who had the world championship or something? Then you random as you mentioned guys like uh, Bob Armstrong, Denver Ed, Martin, etc. There's so many. There are a lot of potential matchups, and I think that's what makes boxing so intriguing beyond some of the other sports. Certainly outside of anything outside of say baseball. Baseball had a period in which, of course, you had the Negro leagues and you had the MLB essentially, I guess, that was kind of competing at the same time. And there you can have what ifs of like, hey, what if these players or these teams would have faced off each other? But in boxing, you just have so many of these what ifs. Like when football started out, there really wasn't a what if as it related to the NFL because it was only essentially the NFL. And, and with basketball, in the early days of basketball, there was a limited amount of teams, and it was really mainly just the NBA, then eventually the ABA, and that combined or whatever later on. But in boxing, we've long had these opportunities for seeing the best fighters in the world face each other. and it even goes back to the days of bare knuckle. I think it's been chronicled. The history of boxing has been chronicled very well because even in the bare knuckle times, they were able to identify and have a lineage for all of the champions that competed during that period. That's why we know about like Tom Cribb and Tom Molyneux and freaking guy. His last name's Mendoza. First name's escapes me, but another fighter who, and these were fighters of varying races, and Bill Richmond, another one. These were varying fighters, but there was sort of a lineage that was passed on. So even in the world of bare knuckles, so that's the intriguing thing about boxing, that even though we didn't get some of these fights, we can look back sort of from a fantasy perspective and wonder what is, because it was covered well enough that we're able to conceive what a fighter may have looked like, and we're able to conceive what it may have been like with two particular fighters that we may not have video of being in the ring. We've seen enough of, you know, say a Mickey Walker, for instance, to understand, and we know that Harry Grant's career is well documented. That even if we don't have the video of the two in the ring, we're able to conceive what it may have been like for the two of them facing off, or what it may have been like for Harry Greb against a Tiger Flowers, who was more of a defensive fighter going up against the Pittsburgh Windmill. We're able to kind of conceive what that may have been like, or Maxie Rosenblum, Slapsy Maxie. I mean, and we have sort of examples just through just modern times and videos and seeing other fighters to conceive and be able to understand. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's definitely great to look back on the history, and I think that helps shed light on a ton of things as it relates to the sport. And it shows that one of the things that I've always mentioned is that while we can get caught in the moment, the modern times, and be prisoners of the moment, um, there's nothing, theoretically speaking, that hasn't been done in the sport of boxing. You dig back deep enough, you'll find the stories. For some cases, there are videos of other boxers, and that's what makes the sport so great, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. These stories, these are mythical figures, and you know, for some fighters, we just don't have footage of them fighting. Barbados Walcott, we just have a little interview with him later in life when he was a caretaker at MSG. But what we do have is the written word, and also we can like go back. We don't have to follow the storylines that we've seen. Like for me, with my research, like here's some newspaper clipping, right? So this is so you see James J.
Yeah.
Jeffries, heavyweight colored Denver Ed Martin.
Hey, real
So
quick, and random shout out to Scrapbook, who dropped into the chat, actually. Scrapbook
absolutely.
Boxing.
Absolutely. Big up Scrap. Yeah, folks, search for anything about boxing history and then just put Scrapbook Boxing after it and buckle up. But I just want to point out that like you see that there are two heavyweight champions here. This is in the newspaper. This is not the way it was described in some documentary. This is actually what was happening in the mode of communication at the time. So Jeffries didn't fight Denver Ed Martin, but Martin had beaten Bob Armstrong. Jeffries had beat Fitz. Jeffries, the winner. I have an article. I don't have it loaded, but there's an article that the winner of it was reporting on Ed Martin taking the title and saying that he was going to be matched with the winner of Jeffries and Fitz. It never happened. Jeffries retired without fighting the colored champ because Johnson had won it off of Denver Ed Martin, I think, in 1903. You can see all the other weights and Joe Walcott and Joe Gans, those great fighters. It mentions that they're colored, but they held like the title. But at heavyweight, such was the prominence of the bracket, there were two champions. That's partly what, again, made Johnson Jeffries such a huge fight. As soon as Johnson won the title, he went back and fought some easier opponents and avoided his top competition because he was angling for that Jeffries fight, big money fight, huge money, and then didn't fight for 2 years after for a variety of reasons. But what we do have from these times is we have extensive write-ups You know, this is on Sam Langford's fight with the great Joe Gans in 1903. That's a lot. It goes round by round. You know, it's not. We don't have to just wonder and just think they were brawling. Like there's a lot of sweet science being described there. So for historical enthusiasts, if you have a good imagination and you kind of understand styles, you can picture sometimes what had happened without seeing it. And then later generations were more blessed. Boxing is a hugely documented sport, the most documented sport in spite of all that's been lost. So we can see Joe Louis fighting. You know, we can see Tony Canzoneri. We only have clips from 3 fights of Sam Langford in over 300 fights. We don't have Blackburn that I'm aware of. No George Byers, no Bob Armstrong. You know, we have some Jack Johnson, but there's just so much to study. And back in the day, it was the schedules were really busy and the write-ups were epic for big fights. You find the newspaper, especially in the home market. So this is from the Boston newspaper, one of the Boston papers. You know, recapping the fight round by round. You know, all the action. And this is how people used to enjoy it who couldn't go live or who were betting on the results. So, you know, we're just doing what a lot of people then did. Not, you know, it's not like everyone could afford to go and travel to these fights, even if they were just a few towns over. So we're not doing much different than people were doing before, trying to learn about these fights, especially like stings, like Harry Greb and the Mickey Walker fight being filmed, and then it's just we don't have it. But that's we just deal with that. We do have footage of other fighters, and so by the time Lewis came around, we definitely get that footage. Rocky, there's some great stuff to watch. So we're gonna call it soon here. I gotta head in, but I've just encouraged everyone to sort of, I suppose the people listening are historically inquisitive and just go check it out because you find some surprising stuff. I definitely have researching Langford, and he was epic. He was a character. He was an entertainer. He couldn't get that fight, but he was the traveling show. And for Wills to get the best of the hardest puncher of that generation that Wills came into. There's clippings from the article like, they're basically, and this is when Johnson was the champion, and they were like, Langford is the man. And that's what Fitz had been. Fitz wasn't a big guy. Langford wasn't a big guy. And later on, Rocky wasn't a big guy. The idea that size does count, but people can use it against them, just like Rocky used his short reach, that wonderful inside work and his style, like being difficult to hit and the way he would exit out of combos and things. Just wonderful stuff. It's a rich history. Josh, I can't thank you enough for coming on the channel once again to celebrate the rich history. Obviously, there's going to have to be a part 5, and that's just fine. I'll get some more graphics. I've got video I'm working on of these fighters we're talking about, but it's just not ready yet. So we'll do that in the next episode. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and the frustrations of today for big fights. That's nothing new. That's nothing new. If we don't get, for some reason, we don't get all these top heavyweights fighting each other by the time they're too old, or if it happens afterwards, well, that's nothing new, man. Jeffries wasn't Jeff. He wasn't still the guy he'd been. Johnson was brilliant, so even when he was in his 30s, he was brilliant, so he could get by. But it's a rich history in boxing. We're going to talk some more about it. Thanks everyone for coming by, and it's really great to have you. Thanks for listening, everybody, after the fact, and keep an eye open for part 5 and check out Josh's channel, 86Boxing. Josh, thanks for coming through, man. That was awesome.
Anytime. Thank you, everyone.
All right, take care, everybody.